Hello and welcome back to another Flutzes and Waxels video. In this last video of this mini-series, we are here to talk all about choreographic elements in ice dance. These elements are used slightly differently than other ice dance elements. Unlike other elements, they don't have multiple levels, and the requirements are very loose. In some ways, these elements are much like the 6-0 system of ice dance, allowing for things like lying on the ice, putting your hands down, and really upping the level of drama. We'll get into all of the ways these things happen as we go through the different types of choreo elements and how they work. We'll start by breaking down the different types of choreo elements, followed by the difference between them at the junior and senior levels, the scoring, and some of the ways choreo elements are different from other elements. And we'll talk about the ways they're allowed to break the rules. Each choreo element is defined by the ISU, but to encourage creativity, the definitions are loose, and many of the choices teams make could actually fall into multiple categories. There are 5 types of choreographic elements, and teams have the ability to choose which ones they'd like to do in the free dance. The first is the choreographic sliding movement. This is the simplest of all of the categories. The sliding movement is any movement executed by both partners which involves sliding across the ice in any way which has a large portion of the skater's weight off of the blades. You may see these kinds of movements elsewhere in programs and in other disciplines, but the choreo sliding movement pushes past the limits of the other disciplines and outside of this movement. Slides that would result in fall deductions, like sliding on both knees, sliding on arms, backs, stomachs, or hands, are all fair game, and are in fact encouraged in the choreo movement. The movement can be almost anything, so long as it slides. It can be in hold or not, or a combination. It can rotate or not, and can be completely identical from both partners, or can be complementary movements. The only requirements are that it must be at least 2 seconds, and cannot come to a dead stop in a position that would usually result in a fall deduction, like on both knees or with a hand down. This is the one time this element will result in a fall deduction. It also cannot be just a simple lunge, to force skaters to try something new, push the limits, and actually slide across the ice, rather than the much more safe option of a drag or lunge, which is allowed in any program at any time as a choreographic feature, but not a choreographic element. For some choreographic elements, the element must follow certain restrictions in terms of when in the order of elements it can happen. But the choreo sliding movement can happen at any point in the program. The next option for teams is the choreographic dance lift. Unlike other dance lifts, there are few restrictions on this lift. There are only 2 requirements for the dance lift, beyond one partner obviously lifting the other. They are that the lift must be between 3 and 10 seconds from beginning to end, and that it must be the last lift in the program. The lift may be straight line, curve, rotational, stationary, or some kind of combination. There are no real requirements for the body positions of the lifted partner. This gives teams a little more room for experimentation to try something that might not fit in the restrictions of the other lifts, or which may be beautiful or simple or complex, so long as it suits the music. The next 2 options are pretty similar. Both the choreographic spinning movement and the choreographic twizzling movement require both partners to rotate at the same time, but they don't meet the requirements for the same kind of element elsewhere in the program. The choreographic spinning movement is the simpler of the 2, with less restrictions. It can happen at any point in the program and must have at least 2 revolutions. Both partners must spin on a common axis, which can move across the ice throughout the movement. This means it often resembles a simple dance spin or stationary or rotational lift. This movement can be done on 1 foot or 2 feet for each partner, and they can change the number of feet they spin on throughout the movement. Plus, one partner can be lifted in the course of the element. Changing the number of feet on the ice between the 2 partners is encouraged, and variance is great. The ISU spells out a lot of options for teams, but the element is basically wide open for teams to be creative and experimental. The choreographic twizzling movement has a few more rules, but is still pretty open-ended. It must be done after the synchronized twizzling element and is evaluated in 2 parts. The first part has to be done by both partners. Both skaters must complete at least 2 revolutions on either 1 foot or 2 and must travel during the rotations. The second part can be done by either one partner or both, and must also be a minimum of 2 revolutions. This part can either continue traveling or it can be stationary. There can be a gap between the 2 parts, or they can transition quickly between the 2. There is no limit on the number of steps between the 2 parts, or a time limit from start to end of the element. The parts should involve some sort of change, of position, of direction, of ice coverage, or some other kind of change, which clearly defines the change between part 1 and part 2. Just doing 4 revolutions is not going to cut it. The whole element can be done on either 1 foot or 2, leaving plenty of room for creativity. And especially in part 2, skaters are encouraged to have different steps between the partners. The last option is the choreographic character step sequence. This is a newer addition, and it also has the most rules. This is why, on occasion, teams will lose credit for their character step, like this past season at the Finlandia Trophy, where several teams received no credit for their character step. Teams can do the character step at any point in the program, and they can be in hold, not touching, or moving in and out of hold throughout the step sequence. Unlike other step sequences, there are no requirements for the turns and movements done to get credit. But the sequence must be done on the short axis of the ice, which means they're skating near the middle of the longer side of the ice from one set of boards to the other. Typically, this means skaters skate towards the judges, but they can also start their character step in front of the judges and move away from them. The character step needs to start near the midline, the middle point of the long axis, but they don't have to be dead center. They must be within 10 meters of the middle point. However, because it's not like the referee can follow teams around with a tape measure, this distance is measured approximately, with meters being measured in arms lengths. So, skaters must be within 10 arms lengths of the middle axis when they begin and end their step sequence. Again, this isn't something that can be measured definitively, so it is up to discretion whether a team is too far from the midline at the start, and the start point can be debated depending on how the program is skated. Some teams will come to a dead stop near the boards to mark the beginning and end of the element, while others will transition more seamlessly in and out of the element. Teams must also cover the entire short midline. They must skate barrier to barrier, boards to boards, within 2 meters on each side, which is again measured in approximate arms lengths. This seems to be where most teams lose their credit for this element. Some teams, especially those without a stop to define the beginning of the element, will appear to begin the character step near center ice. And while a lenient panel may not invalidate the element, that is a risk. The last requirement is for the allowed distance between the partners. Typically, in ice dance programs, skaters can't separate by more than 2 meters or 2 arms lengths, but this rule is relaxed in the character step. They're allowed to separate by 4 meters rather than 2. But they still must be cautious not to get too far apart if they do choose to push this limit. Skaters all approach this element a little differently, but technical falls like putting a hand down, sliding on knees, and other choreographic choices will not result in a fall deduction like they would in other places within the program. This isn't a traditional step sequence, so as long as it approximately travels barrier to barrier down the midline axis, anything goes. Whatever boundaries are pushed are all good. This general rule applies to all of the choreographic elements. Skaters are encouraged to push the limits of ice dance. This has pulled out some new artistic choices and has brought back some which were previously banned. But some of the banned movements are still a little too far, even for the choreographic elements. Things like dying on ice, where skaters would routinely end programs on their backs or stomachs, ending their programs with a melodramatic death, is still not allowed. This is the presumed reason the sliding movement cannot come to a dead stop. This covers the basic requirements for each of the choreographic elements. They are overall fairly simple and broad in terms of requirements, but there's still a few things to tackle. Up first is the difference between the choreographic element requirements at the junior and senior levels. This season, teams have different numbers of required choreographic elements depending on their level. At the junior level, teams choose 2 elements to do, and at the senior level, teams must choose 3. However, at the senior level, one of the 3 choreographic elements selected must be the character step. They can choose any of the other 4 for the remaining 2 elements. This, of course, doesn't mean that junior teams can't choose the character step, but the ISU's Ice Dance Committee sometimes chooses to fully explore a choreo element by forcing everyone at a level to do it. Many junior teams choose the character step for one of their options, but I hope over the season you began to notice that all of the senior teams were doing the character step. This has an added bonus of adding one more element for direct comparison for all senior teams. While it won't really help you evaluate the technical ability of the teams, it may provide some insight into which teams are the most creative or the most willing to commit to a theme, even if it can be a little ridiculous. And now we dive into scoring. All of the choreographic elements have a base value of 1.10. No matter how creative, unique, or difficult the choreo element is, all of them have that same base value of 1.1. But there is a ton of room to gain more points with creativity through GOE. Unlike with other elements, the choreo element's GOE isn't capped at 50% of the base value. Teams can earn up to 4.15 on each choreo element in GOE. Though negative GOE doesn't often happen in these elements, it can happen from time to time. In these cases, the negative GOE can cost them up to the entire base value of the element. Even just a -1 can cost a team 0.22, which may seem small, but when the element has such a low base value, but so much ability to gain in the GOE, it can make a world of difference. And finally, we dive into the exceptions to other rules in the choreographic elements. We touched on them a little, but let's take a bit of a closer look. Unlike most of the time in skating, in some of the choreographic elements, fall restrictions are all but non-existent. In both the character step and the choreographic sliding movement, skaters can slide on both knees, put their full weight on their hands, and push the limits of what would otherwise be a technical fall without a deduction. This doesn't mean, however, that it's impossible to get a fall deduction during these elements. It doesn't happen often, but a genuine fall would still result in a deduction. And if the sliding movement comes to a dead stop while skaters are in a position like on both knees, which would normally result in a fall, they will still receive the deduction. Similarly, as we discussed before, ice dancers are not allowed to separate by more than 2 meters, except in the character step, where they can separate up to 4 meters. This only applies in the character step, so skaters must be cautious not to separate too much in the other choreographic elements. And separating more than 4 meters in the character step would still be incredibly costly. Choreographic elements have broad and wide descriptions, which means that you never know what you'll see in an actual program. But hopefully, this will help you spot them a little bit easier, and especially understand the GOE and scoring a little better on these elements. They may seem like throwaway elements, but those GOE points can make a world of difference. And a great set of choreographic elements can take a program from good to great. Some of the most entertaining programs have some of the strongest choreographic elements. This covers the basics of choreographic elements, and I hope this will make watching ice dance even more fun for you this upcoming season. This is the end of the series for now, but we look forward to bringing you all kinds of skating content on Flutzes and Waxels, a figure skating podcast, during whatever kind of 2020-2021 season we get. Subscribe and listen wherever you find your podcasts.